FM YWHA in March 1968. This program was presented by Loren Eiseley, who reads and comments on his poems about, in his phrase, the human ability to reach out into the universe, a subject on which Loren Eiseley must be considered an expert. Distinguished scientist, anthropologist, paleontologist, recipient of honorary doctoral degrees from several universities and of many scientific awards, Dr. Eiseley currently occupies a position as professor of anthropology and history of science and curator of the Early Man Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. He has published several books: The Immense Journey, Darwin's Century, The Mind as Matter, and other notable works, in addition to many magazine articles and verse. Here is Loren Eiseley.
Good evening. I feel a little strange here, actually, occupying this platform that has seen so many distinguished poets, and as a matter of fact, I'm one of these people who more or less wander in a forlorn fashion between one discipline and another, always a little uncertain of themselves. But I thought this evening, with your consent, I might experimentally explain a little about my views in connection with both science and literature, and perhaps to a degree try and illustrate it in connection with some readings of both verse and prose from my own work. Some weeks ago, I happened to be down on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and I was out strolling along the shore one day when the sea was running rather high. And as I came along through the surf, a little shell rolled up to me. And I picked it up, and I was fascinated because this shell contained upon its surface a curious row of what one might term hieroglyphic inscriptions. And as I looked at this shell, it occurred to me that long before man inscribed documents upon clay or upon papyrus, he must have been looking at the natural world around him in a kind of symbolic fashion. As I strolled along that shore, I could see little faces peeping at me from shells that had been broken in such a fashion that there were faces upon them, masks of one sort or another, either etched by sea worms or in other ways accidentally representing human faces in either astonished or agonized ways. Little masks that could very well have, in some areas of the world, been the first representations of the kind of masks that man eventually created for himself. And that alphabet in golden letters carries the scientific appellation, that is the shell, of conus spurius, the false alphabet. I don't know why the man who named it chose to name it a false alphabet, because to my mind, nature itself has an alphabet of its own, and man, symbol-using man, oracular man, if you will, the creature seeking news of the future from oracles, always cross-examining his universe, even when he is illiterate, has found in these seemingly meaningless symbols real symbols that have affected him and his destiny. In a similar fashion, the countryside, which has had such a profound influence upon many writers of literary natural history, has left a comparable imprint upon the human mind. You may remember that Stevenson once made the remark that there were landscapes that demanded a story, landscapes so wild, having such an effect upon the human mind that to the imaginative person something was bound to emerge. Now, all my life, in one way or another, perhaps partly because of experiences I have had when young, I have felt that this is true. And I have gone on to a very considerable extent, even though involved with the domain of science, writing and speaking about kind of lost land, the Badlands of western Nebraska and the Dakotas, which, although I am years away from these experiences, have left this kind of impact, just as Hudson, long after leaving the Patagonian pampas, continued to write about it, and it emerges so powerfully in his work. So I would merely comment that Conus Spurius, the golden false alphabet of nature, I cannot see as false at all. Rather, it is part of that double way in which we look at the world. You'll remember there's a little South American fish, a quite unique fish, who has his eyes so arranged that part of the lens is adapted for seeing in the air, out of water, in another medium. And the lower part of the lens is differently adapted for seeing in the water because of the difference in refraction involved. And in a sense, I think the person who wants to look at the world through both the spectacles of science and that other closely related domain of literature, and believe me, it's much more closely related creatively than I think we imagine, or that many of us do. In a way, this is the kind of eyesight which is demanded. Blake realized it and said, "I see with a double vision." And what he meant was, in essence, this business of seeing the realities of the world and at the same time seeing those vast luminous shadows that loom behind the realities. And I think, therefore, that we might say, in essence, that the seeming meaninglessness of nature's voices, of nature's symbols, are also significant to man in terms of what is past and to come, as these symbols are translated in his own mind. And that conus spurius, to use this single example, that beautiful, fragile golden alphabet impressed on these shells by nature, is not quite as spurious, even though indecipherable, as it appears. Well, so much for this. I'm going to read, as I said, a little about some of the things that have interested me, some of the background I may make a comment upon from time to time as we go along. And I think that I will start with something which happens to interest me very much, the matter of glaciation, which sounds like a sober enough scientific subject. The country I'm about to speak of here is one near my former hometown out in Nebraska, and it is a country which has been passed over by the ice. And in connection with an essay dealing with glaciation several years ago, I wrote something about it that I will read here, and then I will show you the way this same subject, and indeed this same area, was treated in verse. In my home country, near a small town now almost vanished from the map, there is a region which remains to this day uncultivated. It is best seen at nightfall, because it is then that the full mystery of the place seizes upon the mind. Red granite boulders, hundreds of miles from their point of origin, thrust awkwardly out of the sparse turf. In the last glow from the west, one gets the impression of a waste over which has passed something inhumanly remote and terrifying, something that has happened long ago, but which here lies close to the surface. Crows circle above it like disturbed black memories which rise and fall but never come to rest. It is a barren and disordered landscape which remembers and perhaps again anticipates the cold of glacial ice. It has nothing to do with man. Its gravels, its red afterglow, are remnants of another era in which man was of no consequence. One instinctively feels that if anything were to graze here, it would be mammoth, great sullen, shapeless hulks in the dead light. No one crosses these fields. An invisible barrier confronts one at every turn. Man literally ends here. Beyond lies something morosely violent, of which we have no knowledge, or of which it might be better said that we have a traumatic eagerness to forget. For lurking in this domain is still the nature that created us, the nature of ringing ice fields, of choked forests, of unseasonable thunders. It is the unpredictable nature of the time before the gods, before man had laid hold upon any powers with his mind. It is a season of helplessness that stirs our submerged memories and that causes us to turn back at twilight to the safe road and the lights of town. Behind us whisper the ancient, uncontrollable winds. An animal cries harshly from the dark field we refuse to enter. But enter it we must, though the effort lifts the long vanished ruff of hair along our nape. This is man's place of birth, this region of inarticulate terror, and this is the story of how he came through the clouds of forgetfulness to find himself in a world which has vanished. Now I will try and present this from another point of view, namely that of verse. dusk interval. Here is the waste, the stone, the streaming sunset where no clouds pass. Here where the hawk's dark wing goes lonely over sheep-bitten grass, green ice once crawled and scarred the meadow. The boulders lie as they were dropped in that tremendous plowing. The crows cry clamorous above it in the twilight evening. They do not stoop. The rich grain and the harvest are not found here. Nighthawks loop erratic spirals in the windy starlight. The fallow ground is sleeping, and I know with what goes sleeping deep under sound. Oh, not for long the grass, the bells of grasses. The mice who love their hidden runways will soon pass. The boulders will lift and move. This land is sleeping in a dream of mammoth. Their heavy tread will sound again. Sometime their feet will shudder, the last man from his bed. And another interpretation in another way, the elementals, the rock ribs, the cold root-nourishing stones jut free here. The drop pebbles of the earlier ice lie in windrows along the valley, and the orange butterflies dance over them the illusion of summer. Yellow and gold, soft colors of the interglacials between ice ages past and one oncoming, with both in evidence. Soft butterfly summers drop seeds in rich harvest round the heart's full season. But the contours of rock are a little bleak that remember equally seasons of ice and blue air. And then this attempt to get an impression of the whole great symphonic movement of evolution. All the way back into Cambrian time, we know that sunlight fell as it falls now upon this planet. As Lyell taught, we can tell this by the eyes of fossil sea creatures such as the trilobites. We know that rain fell as it falls now upon wet beaches that had never known the step of man. We can read the scampering imprints of the raindrops upon the wet mud that has long since turned to stone. We can view the ripple marks in the sands of vanished coves. In all that time, the ways of the inanimate world have not altered. Storms and wind, sun and frost have worked slowly upon the landscape. Mountains have risen and worn down. Coastlines have altered. All that world has been the product of blind force and counterforce, the grinding of ice over stone, the pounding of pebbles into mountain torrents, a workshop of 1,000 hammers and shooting sparks in which no conscious hand was ever visible, today or yesterday. Yet into this world of the machine, this mechanical disturbance surrounded by desert silences, a ghost has come. A ghost whose step must have been as light and imperceptible as the first scurry of a mouse in Cheop's tomb. Musing over the archaean strata, one can hear and see it in the subcellars of the mind itself. A little green in a fulminating spring, some strange objects floundering and helpless in the ooze on the tide line, something beating like a heart until a mounting thunder goes up through the towering strata, until no drum that ever was can produce its rhythm, until no mind can contain it, until it rises wet and seaweed-crowned, an apparition from marsh and tide pool, gross with matter, gurgling and inarticulate, ape and man-ape, gristly and fang-scarred, until the thunder is in oneself and is passing to the ages beyond, to a world unknown, yet forever being born. It is carbon, says one, as the music fades within his ear. It is done with the amino acids, contributes another. It rots and ebbs into the ground, growls a realist. It began in the mud, criticizes a dreamer. It endures pain, cries a sufferer. It is evil, sighs a man of many disillusionments. Since the first human eye saw a leaf in Devonian sandstone, and a puzzled finger reached to touch it, sadness has lain over the heart of man. By this tenuous thread of living protoplasm stretching backward into time, we are linked forever to lost beaches whose sands have long since hardened into stone. The stars that caught our blind amphibian stare have shifted far or vanished in their courses, but still that naked, glistening thread winds onward. No one knows the secret of its beginning or its end. Its forms are phantoms. The thread alone is real. The thread is life. Nevertheless, there is a goal we seek to console ourselves. The thread is there. The thread runs to a goal. But the thread does run a tangled maze. There are strange turns in its history, loops and knots and constrictions. Today, the dead beasts decorate the halls of our museums, and that nature of which men spoke so trustingly is known to have created a multitude of forms before the present, played with them, building armor and strange reptilian pleasures, only to let them pass like discarded toys on a playroom floor. Nevertheless, the thread of life ran onward, so that if you look closely, you can see the singing reptile in the bird, or some ancient amphibian fondness for the ooze where the child wades in the mud. And in terms of the long pursuit of fossil history, one can approach these things in a variety of ways. And some of those ways, again, from the standpoint of verse, I will try and experiment with a little here. Here is one way of looking at the fossil record in terms of the present. And this poem is entitled, "Say It Is Thus with the Heart." The rain has been drunk from these bald and sun-beaten ridges. Only the boulders have kept through the weathers of time the marks where the feet of a lizard scurried and crept, or a strange leaf out of a strange autumn far off and long past, or a small blue shell that was one of thousands whose shapes did not last. These are the things that the past and the future cherish, not wisdom, not grace, but a small blue shell or the mud where a scaled beast stumbled may last for a space. Say it is thus with the heart, say that only tricks of season and snow are victors at last. Without anger, say that no one could know your face that 100 had sworn to remember forever comes as well to this end, replaced by a voice, by a fancy, by nothing but a leaf from a long ago wind. There is another way one wanders back and forth through this long time range, which perhaps to a degree divorces one from one's time and place. I was joking with my secretary the other day. She caught me writing 1858 on a letter. And I looked up in sort of puzzled amazement about what this little matter of a century or so mattered. The sandburrs say no. Along the edge of the airfield, between the wind blasts from ascending bombers, low life that tougher seeds from the far Cretaceous surreptitiously test the concrete with the old mindlessness. Seed fractures and wait. The blue devils darning needles dance their mating ecstasy across the bombing targets. Nature's archaic first streamlining, still magnificent in a small way, but useless, the napalm deadlier, more purposeful. But the sandburrs say no. The sandburrs are older. The sandburrs toughen the seed containers, the life bombs against petrol, thermite, nitrix. The sandburrs, like spendthrift governments, pack the little brown bullets and send them out on each wind. Each season, they test the concrete and the bombers' targets. The explosions are soundless, but the stone fractures. The sandburrs say no with the life bombs. The sandburrs say no. Quite a long time ago, I happened to see a big snowy owl under circumstances that attracted me, and I will here return, in a sense, to glacial matters, but with some attention to some of the human problems involved. But first, I'll read you the little poem, which, in a sense, again implies something of this feeling about the impermanence of cities and the way in which the natural world may look upon us. This owl, white-winged upon my chimney top, one with the unseen presences of air, has come 1,000 miles without a stop upon the blizzards from his Arctic lair. He knows the shifting forms that moisture takes, the freezing crystals of the upper void. He scans indifferently the falling flakes that make his world. His hunger is not cloyed. The city is not real to him at all. He takes it for a perch upon the blast after a meal of field mice, and will fall asleep a moment, judging it will last, firm for an owl's claw, till the time he'll flit up through the dark and let snow cover it.